In this rebuttal, I'd like to address Letusreason's opening statement and demonstrate how his conclusions do not refute the debate proposition that there is only one class of Christians with one eternal hope. First, Letusreason brings up Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and attempts to contradict the notion that the woman is Eve by asking several questions, and then tries to tie this text together with Revelation chapter 12 and the woman that is being spoken of there. But I have to ask this of my opponent. What does this have to do with the proposition of the debate? In no way did Letusreason use either one of these texts to deny any of my three contentions or the proposition of the debate. Next, he goes on to answer how he could say that there are only 144,000 in this anointed class of Christians, yet these are more numerous than natural Israel. Well, the text in question is Galatians chapter 4, verse 27, which states that the children of the desolate are more numerous than the one who has a husband. In other words, the number of spiritual Israel is more numerous than natural Israel. So how does Letusreason explain this? Well, he argues that since natural Israel didn't produce any sons of God or spiritual children, then the number of spiritual Israel is automatically larger in number. And this interpretation is problematic for a number of reasons. First, the text does not say that the spiritual children of one is more numerous than the spiritual children of the other. This is something that Letusreason is reading into the text. Instead, it simply states that the children of one is more numerous than the children of the other. And second, to say that one has no children actually doesn't make any sense, for the text says that she has children. Think about it this way. What if I made the following statement? Person A has more children than person B. Now, it would make no sense to speak of one having more children than the other if the other had no children. The reason being, you'd never say that person A has more children than person B if person B has no children, because in that very statement, you're affirming that person B has children. But besides Letusreason making a logical mistake in his interpretation, he's actually disagreeing with the text itself, because verses 23 through 25 in chapter 4 talks about the actual children of the slave woman. Now this proves that Paul, in verse 27, is comparing the spiritual children produced by one as being more numerous than the children in slavery that are produced by the other. And to make matters more difficult for Letusreason, he will have to respond to the cumulative case that I presented in my opening. Remember, I referenced Genesis chapter 13, verse 16, where the number of Abraham's descendants are like the dust of the earth, as well as Hosea chapter 1, verse 10, where these ones cannot be numbered, not because their number has not yet been given, but because their number is so great that they cannot be numbered. Next in his discussion was Romans chapter 11 and the branches that were broken off while others are grafted in. Now the problem in his view is his assumption that Romans 11 is talking about a select group of Christians, namely the 144,000 anointed ones, in contrast to the rest of true Christians. But this is the very thing that he is trying to prove. So, this interpretation set forth by him is little more than an unproven assumption that he is reading into the text of Romans 11. And towards the end of his presentation, Letusreason then goes on to explain the two-class theology and finalizes his presentation. One thing he asks is, where in the Bible does it say that all Christians rule as kings? Well, my answer to that is simple. If it can be established biblically that all Christians are in the New Covenant, are Abraham's descendants, and are in the kingdom, well then it naturally follows that all Christians will be kings and priests in the kingdom when they rule on this earth. And again, these are all points that have been established from my opening statement. Next, Letusreason asks, what would millions of kings rule over anyway? Now it's interesting that Letusreason asks this question because even the Watchtower admits that they don't know who the subjects will be after the millennium. And this is stated in the January 15th, 2012 Watchtower Study Edition on page 30 and paragraph 18. So, according to the Watchtower, we have kings that rule forever and ever, but we don't know who they rule over. So if the Watchtower doesn't have to say who they rule over, then why should I? Next, he asks if, in the Old Covenant, were all Jews kings and priests? Now this question assumes that the Old Covenant will be like the New Covenant. But such reasoning is fallacious and actually contradictory to what the Scriptures say about the tension between the covenants. And just to name a few. First, Hebrews chapter 8 verse 8 speaks of the Old Covenant as being faulty, which implies that the New Covenant will be faultless. Second, this covenant is said to be new. Now obviously, the mention of newness implies that something will be different. And we know that it is different because Hebrews chapter 8 verse 9 explicitly tells us that it is not like the Old Covenant. So if the Old Covenant is not like the New Covenant, then why is Letusreason trying so hard to make it like the New Covenant? So instead of trying to make the Old Covenant like the New Covenant in ways that fit your theology, why not let the Scriptures define for us what the New Covenant will be like? And if it turns out that all Christians will be kings and priests, according to the Scriptures, which obviously makes the New Covenant different in this regard, then why not let it be so? Another claim that Letusreason makes is that there are greater and lesser positions in the kingdom. And he interprets this to mean that some will be in the kingdom as rulers and some will not be in the kingdom as rulers. Yet he doesn't provide any scriptures to support this. Instead, he just asserts it. So while I agree that there will be greater and lesser positions in the kingdom, I deny that such distinctions separate Christians into two classes. In regarding Revelation chapter 20, Letusreason makes a very unusual statement. Quote, if all Christians were kings in God's kingdom, then no one would be capable of dying at the end of the 1,000 years in Revelation 20 verse 9. Unquote. But such a statement is completely unsubstantiated in light of the biblical text. Obviously, the ones who die in Revelation chapter 20 verse 9 are not believers. But what about Daniel chapter 7 verse 14? Who are the ones who serve Christ there? Well, apparently, according to my opponent, these ones who serve Christ are not the same ones who rule with Christ. But where does Daniel chapter 7 make this distinction? Well, it doesn't. But even then, is Letusreason going to argue that the kings and priests don't serve Christ? Well, surely not. If Christ is the sovereign ruler in the kingdom, then even those rulers who are in subjection to him must submit to his rule, though they are themselves rulers and kings. Another argument from Revelation 20 made by Letusreason goes as follows, quote, the kings of the kingdom are granted immortality before the 1,000 years, so that those who die when the 1,000 years are over, who served with Christ for that the whole time and were Christians, were obviously not kings ruling because they could die. There are several assumptions that are made in this objection that are not substantiated by the text. First, Letusreason assumes that there are Christians who are serving Christ in the 1,000 years who aren't kings or rulers. Yet, you will not find this in Revelation 20, nor will you find it in Daniel chapter 7. These are assumptions that are read into the text, rather than conclusions that are derived from the text. And second, Let Us Reason argues that these ones couldn't be kings and rulers because they could die. Well, yes, I agree with that. But what Let Us Reason fails to prove is that these ones who die were at one point Christians, which is something that the text does not explicitly state. Instead, this is something he is reading into the text in order to support his position. Overall, Let Us Reason did very little, if anything, to deny the proposition that there will be only one class of Christians with one eternal hope. In fact, it seems as though much of the information was not only irrelevant to denying the proposition, but was completely loaded with unproven assumptions. And if we have time in the cross-examination section, I would very much like to challenge Let Us Reason on his interpretation of Revelation chapter 7 and whether or not this supports his position. But until then, I look forward to his rebuttal, where I hope he deals with the arguments that I made in my opening presentation. Thank you.